How's it going, everybody? Eulier here, and in today's video we're going to take a look at the project setup and routing from Next, which is a course taught by Scott Moss. Shout out to Scott Moss, which is the CEO and co-founder of Superfilter.ai. He has previously worked at Netflix. He has over 10 years of experience working in the software industry, as well as before working as a software engineer, he went through the Navy. He worked as fixing helicopters. That was a very interesting job. And now here we are, right? Looking at Next.js. And what is the end goal of this course? Is to look at the fundamentals of that you need to know about the latest feature of Next.js, or in this case Next 13, to build these full stack applications, and on top of React, that's what Next.js it is built on top of React, to build now from basic blocks to up to full stack applications and API. You may wonder, why do I need to take a look at this? Why are the things that we're also going to learn here? We're going to learn a lot of techniques in the project structure, such as server-side rendering, static-side generations, data fetching, building an API and creating page, layout, server components, client components, server action, and a lot of or a couple of things that it is important to, before dive into that, take a look at the introduction, which is part of the first section of today's video. I'm going to make a quick recap so then we can jump into the project setup routing. Why this is important as a way to understand how do we get here. Why is important and relevant to understand how do we get here? Because once you understand that, then you will understand what this tool does for you. Therefore, you're going to embrace the complexity. So React was a product made by Facebook in 2011, and then made up open source in 2013, and now became the JavaScript frameworks by default, and grow in popularity as well as in its community. So here we're just talking about is what Scott Moss is doing actually. So what he did, who is Scott Moss, what he did, what he's doing right now. He's pretty much like listening and taking technical pitch, pretty much like Shark Tank. So what he does is to writing curriculums, taking technical speech from founders, which they need to keep up their technical skills as sharp as possible, in writing code, right? So the point of understand where React came from, and some caveats about this course, which is something that we're gonna see is the latest version of Next. We're gonna mention a previous way of how things were done, but not that we're not going to there. I'm not going to, or in this course, we're not going to there too in depth. In once we look at React, understand where it comes from, why this is so popular, and this is something that allows us to build this user interface, but it doesn't come with other features that are relevant when it comes to build web applications. For example, like router, you need to actually add that on, or a state management. Okay, so for example, like Redux, and For example, we can leverage that and take and harness the full power of the community. But for big companies, the last thing they want to do is to go and do the last thing they want to do is to go and shopping open source, especially because if you want to put, so they don't want to put their company's resource back on some random people out there, especially working on a basement and developing a router. So that's why we have solutions like Angular, which are backed by companies, and it makes sense. So because since there is a lot of machinery here, especially to try to make the user experience as fast as possible, by now offering is the best experience, fast as possible. With React, we have something called client-side rendering, server-side rendering, as a way to actually satisfy the user needs. And the infrastructure of this, it was quite hard. It was very, very hard to set up everything. So I think that also is what speed up things here, which is something that he mentioned here. And I think that kind of expedited that the fact that we have now to render is the client-side rendering as well as the server, and building these infrastructures was incredibly difficult. So Scott Moss mentioned that, and Next comes with these solutions, or comes to be something compelling to do about it. Okay. So Next is formerly so Virtual is the company behind Next, and formerly Sate. They are now hosting a platforms and have a dedicated team to work on Next.js. And even though there are other frameworks out there that might be quite faster or better, like Quick, where the creator, which is Mishko Heveri, the creator of Angular, as well as this framework Quick, is now much more performance and structure. So it kind of reminds the early days of web development, when you have things like Backbone, when everything is here, Backbone or jQuery, everything is here, it's flexible, you can do that fast, but it's not organized. And yeah, so today's video is all about project setup and routing. Something that I'm quite familiar with, I've had experience here as well. And well, Scott discussed single page application, server-side rendering, and how introduction of the React server component in Next 13 solves some problem with server-side rendering method. Server-side rendering renders initial component to the server, exactly, but requires downloading the full JavaScript like a single page application, making React server components more efficient for performance and user experience. And that's the entire reason why we are looking at it. You might wonder, where do you read that? Because right now I'm looking in a separate window, the course. I'm taking notes out of this. And this is something that I'm going to write it down. So exactly. So Scott discuss, which is the reason why we are doing all of this, okay, is for the user experience, okay, and ultimately the developer experience. So we want to close the gap here. So we want to make developing this application faster while improving the user experience as well. So okay, Scott discuss single, Scott discuss SAP, single page application, server-side rendering, and how the introduction of React server component in Next 13. Okay, Scott discussed single page application, server-side rendering, and how the introduction of React server components, something that I quite experienced that, especially on a previous course when I actually look at how can we make the server-side rendering. There's a lot of pipe, there is a lot of machinery going there, and the whole point of the server-side rendering is to improve the render time. Uh, yeah. So how the introduction of React, okay, React server component, how the introducing of React server component,
Right
which,
into the most craziest thing about
which is something that I'm now quite familiar with. Okay, when you have is the client side and the server bundle, and whatever the user are now, whatever the user now is navigating your app, whether it's on the client or is fetching a request from that from the server, uh, you want to make things smooth as possible. So yeah, Scott discussed SPA, SSR, and how introduction of React server component in Next.js 13, this current version, solve some problems with server-side rendering method. Exactly. Solve some problems of server-side rendering methods. Of the server-side rendering method. Server-side rendering initial component on exactly. So server-side rendering initially render exactly. Server-side rendering renders initially on the server, and render is just a fancy name to say, hey, I'm just going to generate is this HTML that I'm going to send to the browser, and the browser can understand that and render. On the server, okay, server-side rendering renders initially on the server, but requires downloading the full JavaScript. Exactly. But requires to download the full JavaScript, because once the server, once the users want to navigate to an e-commerce website or a product detail, a specific part of your application, the server now is going to initially renders the component, send it to the client, but also needs to download the JavaScript like in a single page, but requires to download the full JavaScript like in a single page, making React Server component more efficient for performance and user experience. Making React component efficient. Okay, making React component efficient for performance and ultimately user experience. Because after all, that's the reason why we get here.
about this framework and all the things that hopefully we have a lot of questions on and stuff like that. But I'm just gonna dive right in.
Okay. So here is when I gotta receive a lot of questions. Yeah, my friend. Yep.
and kind of talk about it, 'cause I think everything going forward is based off this foundation.
Exactly. So everything that's that's going forward is based on this foundation.
So I'm just going to introduce it early on. So there's really not a lot of context right now, but you will build the context later. And that is going to be server components. So React server components is a new paradigm introduced in React 18 and
Interesting. Okay. So we talk about is React component. Because after all, that's what the challenge it is. React React server component. Exactly, because we have is the client component and now we have is the React server component. It makes a lot of sense. Ooh, completely, totally. Mm-hmm. React server component. Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a new feature and it is experimental. This feature is available in the latest canary. React server component, server action, and directive. Here we are, bro. All right, buckle up. Buckle up. You ready?
has been adopted by Next.js 13.
Okay. This is a feature that comes in React 8, version 18 that now is adopted by Next 13. Makes a lot of sense.
And basically, the whole new premise of React.js 18 and Next.js 13 with React server components is trying to address some of the earlier issues we've had with different types of rendering modes in the framework. So before we get into that, let's just...
Okay. So problem. Problem. Different rendering apps mode. Okay, that's the problem. Solution.
talk about like some of these different types of rendering modes. So the one you might be familiar with the most is called a SPA or SPA, single page application. This is just like you did create React app and you just built, you know, something with like React router or some other HTML based router and you built an app. That's a single page application. You just have one index.html page in the browser, and every time you do routing, you're just switching out that div with another component.
Exactly. So different rendering app modes. So we have is a single page application, server side rendering. Okay. Single page applications. The user receive a huge HTML. The user receive an index HTML and huge JavaScript bundles that anytime that impact negatively on first initial pain, okay, or first contentful pain, a web vital metric, okay, from Google. or a Google's, you know, a Google's web vital, or a Google web vital metric. Okay. Contentful, contentful, like you got it. Okay. So if you want to navigate, you just switch from one component to another. You just switching out, exactly. You just switching out components in a div with another component. Yeah, with another component. So pretty basically is what it is.
But the HTML page never goes back to the server and reloads or refetches. So it's just a single page.
Exactly. So the HTML never goes back to the server. So it is an HTML page. So it is a single page or an SPA
that switches out components based off of a router. And this is really cool. This was all the Crave and the Raise, rave back then because, it was quick. Routing was fast. You didn't have to worry about having a server. You can put it on a CDN, different things like that. But it had problems.
Okay, so challenge. Got a challenge. You need to load huge, sometimes huge JavaScript bundles, and also if SEO is a concern, since the web crawler cares that you got the content there in the HTML, not waiting for that to be loaded, that's a problem. Especially for e-commerce. If you're gonna get ranked by the search engine.
The browser had to download all the JavaScript in order for people to see things, not only to see things, but to interact with those things.
Exactly. Also, since the browser is downloading, huge JavaScript, is downloading all the JavaScript first, users needs to wait for the page to get rendered and become interactive.
You also had problems with like crawlers. So like anything like, if you wanted to see if you paste a link to a single page application in something like Facebook or Twitter, it might have been hard for those to see those previews pop up because those crawlers didn't know how to interpret JavaScript and it wasn't going to wait for the JavaScript. So you just wouldn't see your preview.
Exactly. So if you want to see a preview from Facebook or any SCP app since a web crawler doesn't understand JavaScript, you can see those previews. Okay, okay. This is pain points, or in this case is, yeah, pain points. Things to learn. And here it is. How web crawler works. And how to interact with a web crawler. An example of that. How web crawler works. An example. And implementation. Yep, there you go.
You. And I remember it was a time where even Google, was not good at crawling single page applications. So, you had all these companies that would take your app, pre-render it, spit out the HTML, and then give that to a crawler. Or even crazier, you do it dynamically. You create your own server, detect that like, oh, a crawler is on my website. Don't show them the single page application, show them the pre-rendered version instead.
Exactly.
Like that was a thing. I remember having to make that. Our own service. So, you had all these companies that would take your app, pre-render it, spit out the HTML.
Jesus. Oh my God. So you got all of these companies pre-rendered all of the HTML and then give that to the crawler. Oh my God, pre-renders all the HTML and then give them to the crawler. Oh man. Or even crazy. Oh my God. Or even crazy. Got a server that detect if oh my God, you got an entire server dedicated to that. Okay, you don't own the infrastructure. That's what happened. You got a server that detect if the request was made by a crawler. Hey, here is the pre-render, or here's the rendered version of my app. Oh my God. So hey, here is the pre-rendered version of my app. Hey, here's the pre-rendered versions made on the fly of my app. Oh, I get it.
And then give that to a crawler. Or even crazier, you do it dynamically. You create your own server, detect that like, oh, a crawler is on my website. Don't show them the single page application, show them the pre-rendered version instead. Like that was a thing. I remember having to make that.
Yeah, that was a thing, man. And that was costly. That was painful. That was time taking. That was a thing. Oh, nigga.
So it was pretty nuts. So to address that,
Yeah. It was pretty nuts. So to address that, okay. So to address that, we come with server-side rendering. Server-side rendering. Why do you do that? Why do? Oh my God. Okay. Server-side rendering. Really? For sure, man. Okay. Server-side rendering.
That server-side rendering came out, right? Server-side rendering is basically kind of the same thing, but with a different first step. So instead of like rendering everything on the browser and having the JavaScript be downloaded, instead, the initial render of
Exactly. So here is kind of the same thing, but with different initial step.
that page, same thing, but with a different first step.
Exactly. But with a different first step. Oh my god. Okay. Yeah, because we
So
need to
instead of
check
like
that.
rendering everything on the browser and having the JavaScript be downloaded,
Mm-hmm. So instead of rendering everything on the browser,
instead,
yeah. So instead of rendering everything on the browser and having all the JavaScript downloaded,
the initial render of that page or that component happens on the server. So we're going to take that component, render it to HTML, send that HTML to the browser so it shows up instantly without any JavaScript download. And then while that is being shown in the background, download the JavaScript and then have the client version of that same component take over, which allows interactivity.
okay.
And that is that component, render it to HTML, send that HTML to the browser. The initial render of that page or that component happens on the server. So we're going to take that component.
Mm-hmm. So the initials, so server side is kind of the same thing with a different initial step, or with a different first step. So instead of rendering everything on the browser and having to download all the JavaScript, here we are rendering that page. Okay.
That component, render it, JavaScript be downloaded. Instead, the initial render of that page or that component happens on the server.
Exactly. So the initial renders of that component, React component, that can be a page, React component or a page, you name it, layout. So the initial render in singular, okay? So the initial render of that components happens on the server. So it exactly. So renders the HTML and send it to the client.
So we're going to take that component, render it to
Mm-hmm. Happens on the server. So we are gonna take that component, render it, yeah, render it to HTML. This is actually the step here. So the initial render of the component happens on the server. So this. So we're gonna take the component, render. What about if I do this? No. Okay. Okay. No, it's okay. No problem. Exactly. So we're gonna take the component, render it to HTML, send the HTML to the browser. Show something to the user.
Send that HTML to the browser so it shows up instantly.
Exactly. Okay. So it show that instantly. Mm-hmm. with no JavaScript. Exactly. So you show instantly with no JavaScript.
without any JavaScript download. And then while that is being shown in the background,
Exactly. Then while that is being shown in the background, load everything you need.
download the JavaScript, and then have the
Exactly. Well, in the background, download the JavaScript.
client version of that same component take over, which allows
The client version of that component takes.
and then while that is being shown in the background, download the JavaScript, and then have the client version of that same component take over, which
Exactly. The client version of that component takes over. That's one of the reasons why you have now, especially when you're generating is the client side rendering, or the server side rendering. My bad. Is that now you need is to actually wrap that with instead of a component in the case of the client and the server, to say, hey, this component that you want to render on the server, I just want to generate is the okay. There is a lot of steps going on, and the more you understand that specifically, the better off will be. Yeah, yeah. So the client version of that component takes over with allows interactivity. That makes a lot of sense.
allows interactivity, and that swap happens so fast that you don't see it.
Exactly. So that swap happens so fast that you don't see it. But again, this is exactly how you server-side rendering your components in React. You let your components, you take your React components on the server, you generate the HTML, send that to the client, the browser receives that, shows something immediately, and then in the background, load all the JavaScript needed, while now the client version of that component takes over, which allows interactivity. God.
But it does happen. So that way people can see the page immediately. Crawlers can get the information that they want immediately.
Exactly. So now the users in web crawlers or crawlers, yeah. So now users and crawlers can see the page and content immediately. Okay. Immediately.
But you still have to wait for the JavaScript to download in order to be interactive. So
But you also have to wait to download, especially when you're sending the HTML to the client that show up something instantly, while in the background is loading all the JavaScript, which makes your application not interactive. And then the client version of that components take over, which is known as hydration, which allow interactivity. Holy moly. But you also have to wait. That's right. So now the user and crawlers so now the users and crawlers can see the page and the content immediately, but you also have to wait to download all the JavaScript.
people can see the page immediately. Crawlers can get the information that they want immediately. But you still have to wait for the JavaScript to download in order to be interactive.
Exactly. But you also have to wait to download all the JavaScript in order to be interactive. This particular step, the client version, is called as hydration. Is that now the client version of these components takes over to guarantee is the interactivity, because now it has the proper code instructions on the client. Jesus fucking Christ.
So we did solve the problem of seeing things quickly and solving the SEO and crawler's problem, but we didn't solve the problem of, well, what if I want to click on that form as soon as I see it? Oh, well, you can't, because you gotta wait for the JavaScript to download. And
Exactly. So what if I want to quickly interact with a form when I see it? Now, no, you can't until all JavaScript is downloaded. Downloaded.
depending on your internet connection and how big the JavaScript was.
Exactly. So depending on the internet connection, how big JavaScript files are.
It could take a long time. So then form as soon as I see it. Oh, well, you can't, because you gotta wait for the JavaScript to download. And depending on your internet connection and how big the JavaScript was, it could take a long time. So then people got really fancy with like, well, we'll do code splitting. So we'll split the bundle up, and then we'll do dynamic import. So we only.
Okay, so then people become fancy. Oh my god. Okay, then people become fancy. Okay, so now let's do some code splitting. Which is something that is built in in the React library. Okay, as a way to do all of the code splitting business. So you delegate all the code splitting business to React. God damn.
Import code that like, and then it's like, yeah, but are we really solving
Exactly. And import only the code that we needed. The problem remains. The problem remains.
the problem here? So now this brings us to React server components. Server components, what tries to solve some of these problems. So React server components.
Okay. So challenge here. And it is important to understand this storytelling. Yeah, my friend. It is crucial to understand this storytelling. That's why we have React server component. God damn.
It's basically a new way of doing server-side rendering. That it's almost like server-side rendering, except for the fact that there is no JavaScript associated with the component sent to the browser. So you could actually run a React server component entirely without any JavaScript at all. But the caveat is you can't have any interactivity in your component either. You still need client components for that. But by having these server components, this allows us to do like all the data fetching necessary for a page. Imagine you have a blog page that needs to get content from a CMS. You can do that on the server while the component is rendering and send that back to the client without any JavaScript added to it. So there's no need to wait for an entire bundle of JavaScript to download just to see anything or interact. And if there is some interaction on there, well, that interaction, that specific component that has interaction, let's say it's a form, only that component can be a client component. So therefore, that the rest of the page doesn't have to wait for that bundle to download to interact with that form, just so you can like move around. So things are being progressively, what they call progressively enhanced. So we're choosing what to download at what specific time based off what needs, versus like, oh, we can only download everything at one time, even though this whole page doesn't need any interaction, but this one component does. Where now it's like, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just like, yeah, just download the whole page. And then when this thing needs interaction, we can download that progressively. We can actually stream it. So that's kind of like what React Server Components is. Next.js has taken that and built it into the framework. And it's actually pretty cool. It's also slightly confusing if you haven't worked in like a framework that switches between client side and server side JavaScript all in one repo, and it all looks the same. So it's not like, well, this is Express over here and this is React, so I can clearly tell which one's back end and which one's front end. Okay, no, that's not going to happen anymore. You are going to be writing React components, and they could be working on the back end or working on the front end or both. So like having to know which version is doing what is kind of confusing, but we're going to walk through how best not to get confused through some of that. So, and then I'll just talk about a little bit about the difference between React Server Components versus server-side rendering. But basically, server-side rendering performs that. It only does server-side rendering on that initial load, right? So,
exactly, on that initial load.
But then if you try to go back to it, it's just going to be client-side routing. So you kind of lose the benefit of that. Whereas with React Server Components, every time you go to it, it's going to render on the server. So you always get that benefit of never needing JavaScript. This makes the client-side bundle predictable and cacheable, which is really hard to do if the bundle size is always changing. Now you don't have to worry about it changing when you add new pages, because those pages don't contribute to the bundle size because they're server components. So this like makes performance basically easier to do. And yeah, it's not all perfect, but for the time being, I think it's a really good experiment what the React team is doing and what the Next.js team is doing. And we'll see if it sticks. If you ever built something in, let me see, what's an equivalent? Like Elixir, Phoenix, PHP, Ruby on Rails, it's basically that, where you're just doing all the logic for a component, executing on a server and not on a client.
Okay, we are now executing all the logic on the server and not on the client.
So yeah, that was a long spiel. I don't expect you to remember and know all of that. We're going to go through a lot of this in examples, but I wanted to give you that primer. So I'm going to start mentioning some of these words as we write the code, and I want you to know what they are. Cool. Any questions?
I got kind of a weird one.
Yeah.
So like working with like Hotwire for Rails before, like, the HTML over the wire ones that mostly use WebSockets under the hood. Is that what RSC is doing too, or is it?
So I know React 18 implements streaming of the HTML to the browser. I think Next.js has its own approach where they actually just pre-render it instead of streaming it, the HTML, but you do have the ability to like stream data to it. So there is no WebSockets implemented here. There is no real-time component of like streaming HTML like Hotwire or like what Elixir and Phoenix, like what they do, especially in Next.js. They just do the pre-rendering, but I don't think there's anything stopping you from doing it if you wanted to. But I think Next.js does the pre-rendering instead of like doing the streaming
like
by
doing
default.
The streaming by default,
but,
like we'll do React. Okay. Okay, let me read about this, because I think this is something important to actually understand the challenge here. Okay. Because, alright, so what is the notes here? Server component, okay. So now that I understand is the SAP and the server-side rendering, how that works. So because initially when single page application, we have is the index HTML that is sent to the clients, and then we have to wait for all the JavaScript loaded on the browser, and then our application becomes visible and interactive. Okay, that's good, that's great. For example, for back office applications or web internal apps. But when it comes now to, for example, improve the user experience, we say, hey, I want this application load faster. For example, an e-commerce or any other app that needs to be ranked on search engines, first you have to wait for that to become visible and interactive. Second, it also hit the crawler because the crawler expects that you get all the content at once. It won't wait for all of your content to be loaded. So an alternative to that is like, okay, so now let's go for server-side rendering, okay? Where on the server-side rendering, this is pretty much like a normal server-side rendering, but with the difference of the initial step, where here we're gonna render is this component into HTML. So the initial renders is, or the initial renders, okay, something that he mentioned here. So the initial render of the components happened on the server, which is I'm gonna take this React component, I'm gonna render and transform into HTML, send it to the browser so the user can see something immediately, and then on the background load all the JavaScript necessary. So while doing that, our application is not interactive, but that's where the client version of those components takes over and then allows interactivity. So this happens so fast that you don't see that. But the challenge here is that, okay, now that the user can see the content and the crawlers can see the content and rank them properly, our website is not responsive. It's like, what the F happened here? What in the French toast happened here? And that is when people get fancy there, because now we have things like code splitting. So depend of the type of connections, you can see the page, but your application is not interactive. Okay, it's gonna depend on your internet connection, how big the JavaScript was. So that's why people come up with these things like, hey, let's gonna do code splitting. That actually is redoes the initial bundle when you are downloading your application. But actually the problem remains. So React Server component aims to solve this problem. Aims to solve some of these problems in React version 18. Holy moly. Okay. So RSC is a new way of doing server-side rendering by allowing developers to write components to run on the server and stream their output to the client. What does it mean that? Let's gonna keep reading. In RSC, there are two types of components. The server components, which can be rendered on the server, and the client component, which are rendered on the browser. Server components can define as any component that doesn't involve user interactivity. Exactly. So if you have any user interactivity, this is not a good candidate. Like a mouse, click, or keyboard input, or use React hooks like useTag hooks and the use effect. Okay. So server-side can be defined as any component that doesn't involve user interactivity or use React hooks like useTag hooks and use effect hook. The server can render this component and stream them to the browser. The server needs to send the JavaScript code to render only the client component. The server can render this component and stream them to the browser. The server needs to send the JavaScript code to render only on the client component. Okay. So that the JavaScript bundle size is going to be a lot smaller and faster to download. This means that the user interface can become interactive faster during TTIA. So here there's a difference between when your component is gonna get rendered. It's on the client. It has hooks. It has a use effect. It performs any user interaction. If it is, that's a client side code. If it's not, then is a server side code. So this means that the user interface can become interactive faster and doesn't TTI. In contrast, server-side performs server-side rendering only during initial page load. Okay, server-side component perform or SSR perform server-side rendering only only during the initial page load. This means that other than the initial components and all the components are rendered in the browser when server-side rendering is used. So the browser has to download the JavaScript for the whole app just like a single page application. This makes React client-side or React server component more efficient than server-side in terms of performance and user experience. Okay. Because the whole point of this is that we are only the different okay.
If you try to go
They
back,
try to solve is the interactivity issue. Okay. They try to solve the interactivity issue. React servers aim to solve the interactivity. It aims to solve the interactivity issue. They try to solve some of the interactivity issues. So React Server Component aims to solve some of the interactivity issues in React version 18.
back to it, it's just going to be client-side route. So like having to know which version is doing what is kind of confusing, but we're going to walk through how best not to get confused. Next.js has taken that and built it into the framework, and it doesn't need any interaction. But this one MS, you can do that on the server. The caveat is you can't have any interactivity in your component either. You still need client components for that. But that's a new way of doing server-side rendering that it's almost like server-side rendering, except for the fact that there is no JavaScript associated with the component sent to the browser.
There is no JavaScript associated with the component sent to the browser. So there is no associated. Wait, what?
It's almost like server-side rendering, except for the fact that there is no JavaScript associated with the component sent to the browser.
Okay, exactly. But again, because we're talking about React Server Component, so there is no it is not. It is kind like server-side rendering, but there is no JavaScript associated. Okay, but there is no JavaScript associated to that component. But there is no JavaScript associated with the component sent to the browser. That's quite interesting, by the way.
So you could actually run a React server component entirely without any JavaScript at all. But the caveat is you can't have any interactivity.
Exactly. Which means
in your React server component entirely without any JavaScript at all.
Which
But
means
the caveat is
there
you
is
can't have
no
any interactivity in your component either. You still need client components for
in
that.
your
But
component.
by having these server components, this allows us to do like all the data fetching necessary for a page. Imagine you have
Okay. So the use case. Mm-hmm. So the use case for for data oh my god, stop. Why you do that, bro? So the use case, okay, is that data fetching makes a lot of sense.
a component either. You still need client components for that. But by having these server components, this allows us to do like all the data fetching.
Use cases. Having this exactly data fetching. So by having this components, we can exactly
Necessary for a page. Imagine you have a blog page.
exactly by having these components, we can have. By having this component, we can have is a blog page. Yeah, but data fetching. By having these components, we can have data fetching. For example,
That needs to get content from a CMS. You can do that on the server.
exactly. So for example, content from a CMS. You can get that from the server, and then you can
While the component is rendering and send that back to the client without any JavaScript added to it.
exactly. This one, data fetching. By having this component, we can have data fetching. For example, content from the CMS that you can get from the server, and then renders a component.
Imagine you have a blog page that needs to get content from a CMS. You can do that on the server while the component is rendering.
You can get that from the server while the components gets rendered. While the component
And
is
send that back to the
rendering.
client without any JavaScript added to it. So there's no need to wait
Exactly. While the component gets rendered.
for content from a CMS. You can do that on the server
Okay.
while the component is rendering and send that.
Exactly. So while the component gets rendered or is rendering, while the component is rendering, and send that back to the client without any JavaScript. Okay, and send that back to the client without any JavaScript associated, because you already have what is going to be shown.
Back to the client without any JavaScript added to it. So there's no need to wait for an entire bundle of JavaScript to download just to see anything or interact. And if there is some interaction on there, well, that interaction, that specific component that has interaction, let's say it's a form, only that component can be a client component.
Exactly. Okay. Data fetching. If you need to have components with interactivity, only that component must be rendered on the client side. Yeah, on the client side.
So therefore, that the rest of the page doesn't have to wait for that bundle to download to interact with that form, just so you can like move around. So things are being progressively, what they call progressively enhanced. So we're choosing what to download at what specific time.
Okay. So here is when you can choose. Here's what you can do: progressive enhancement.
Interact with that form, just so you can like move around. So things are being
Progressive. So here's what you can do: progressive enhancement. Enhancement.
what they call progressively enhanced. So we're choosing what to download at what specific time based off what needs versus like, oh, we can only download everything at once.
Okay. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can do. Something they call progressive enhancement. Enhancement. Progressive enhancement, where you can show which page you want to render.
Things are being progressively, what they call progressively enhanced. So we're choosing what to download at what specific time.
Okay. So we are choosing what to download. Exactly. So choosing what to download and what to do at a specific time. Yeah, we're choosing what to do and what to. Yeah, we're choosing what to download, what to do, and what to do at a specific time. Okay, this is the two things that offer this React server component. But one of the main use case is that for the data fetching, you can let that component to fetch the data, for example, in a CMS or in a block, while rendering the component, and then send that without any JavaScript associated with. Okay.
Based off what needs versus like, oh, we can only download everything at one time, even though.
Exactly. So instead of downloading everything, at one time, instead of downloading everything at one time.
Oh, this whole page doesn't need any interaction, but this one component does. Where now it's like, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just like, yeah, just download the whole page. And then when this thing needs interaction, we can download that progressively. We can actually stream it.
Okay, we can actually stream it.
So that's kind of, but this one component does. Where now it's like, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just like, yeah, just download the whole page. And then when
just download the whole page, and then when this thing
needs interaction, we can download that.
Okay. So just download the whole page, and when this thing needs interaction, we can download that progressively. Just download the whole. Just download the whole thing. Okay. I think this is the value proposition. The value proposition of server component. Oh my god. Yeah, the value proposition of server component is that just download the whole thing, and when these things need interaction, we're gonna download that progressively. we are going to download progressively. We're just gonna download progressively, and we can actually stream it. And we can actually stream it. Oh my god. Okay. In contrast with, in contrast, God. So in contrast of, again, this is an experimental feature, by the way. In contrast of, oh my god. So in contrast of the server-side rendering, when you say, hey, here's here's the content, here's the entire HTML. Now it's going to download the entire JavaScript bundle for this.
Progressively, we can actually stream it. So that's kind of like what React Server Components.
So instead of downloading everything one time, exactly. So instead of downloading everything at once, so instead of downloading everything at once, okay, so the HTML and then the JavaScript bundle, and then HTML, and then the JavaScript bundle, like a server-side rendering, React component server say, let's just download the whole thing. Okay, let's just download the whole thing, the HTML. And when these things need interaction, we're gonna download progressively, and we can actually stream it. Oh my god. Okay.
Is Next.js has taken that and built it into the framework.
Okay. So Next.js has taken that and built into the framework. This React server component is an this React service component is an experimental feature, which is, to me, is quite that you can find them in their docs. Okay.
And it's actually pretty cool. It's also slightly confusing if you haven't worked in like a framework that switches between client side and server side JavaScript all in one repo, and it all looks the same. So it's not like, well, this is Express over here and this is React, so I can clearly tell which one's back end and which one's front end. Okay, no, that's not going to happen anymore. You are going to be writing React components, and they could be working on the back end or working on the front end or both. So like having to know which version is doing what is kind of confusing, but we're going to walk through how best not to get confused through some of that. So
Okay.
And then I'll just talk about a little bit about the difference between React server components versus server-side rendering. But basically, server-side rendering
Server-side rendering performs that initial load, that initial page load. Okay.
that it only does server-side rendering on that initial load, right? So
Exactly. So the server-side rendering, it only does initial. The server-side rendering, it only renders that on the initial load.
but then if you try to go back to it, it's just going to be client-side routing. So you kind of lose the benefit of that. Whereas with React server components, every time you go to it, it's going to render on the server. So you always get that benefit of never needing JavaScript. This makes the client-side bundle predictable.
Okay. So some benefits. Okay. since React server components only renders in the server, makes the bundle predictable and catchable. Okay. One of the most problematic things in computer science.
And cacheable, which is really hard to do if the bundle size is always changing.
Okay. Which is hard to do if the bundle size is always changing.
Now you don't have to worry about it changing when you add new pages because those pages don't contribute to the bundle size because they're server components.
Exactly. So now you don't have to worry about those components to contribute to JavaScript bundles, since they are not. Since they are not. Since they don't have. Since they don't have. Since they don't have that. Since they don't have it.
So this like makes performance basically easier to do.
So making it perform easy to do. But it's not perfect.
And yeah, it's not all perfect, but you know, for the time being, I think it's a really good experiment what the React team is doing and what the Next.js team is doing, and we'll see if it sticks. If you ever built something in, let me see, what's an equivalent like Elixir, Phoenix, PHP, Ruby on Rails,
The HTML over the wire
Yeah.
Ones that mostly use WebSockets under the hood. Is that what RSC is doing too, or is it?
So I know React 18 implements streaming of the HTML to the browser. I think Next.js has its own approach where they actually just pre-render it instead of streaming it, the HTML, but you do have the ability to like stream data to it. So there is no WebSockets implemented here. There is no real-time component of like streaming HTML like Hotwire or like what Elixir and Phoenix, like what they do, especially in Next.js. They just do the pre-rendering. But I don't think there's anything stopping you from doing it if you wanted to. But I think Next.js does the pre-rendering instead of like doing the streaming by default. But you know,
Hotwire. Hotwire. Hotwire JS. Hotwire. HTML over the wire. Okay. It's an alternative approach for building modern web application without using much JavaScript by sending HTML instead of JSON over the wire. Okay. Stimulus Strata, brought to you by the makers of Basecamp and Hey. 37 signals. What is this? Oh, I get it. Again, it's not all of the bundle is loaded. You know, it's like 37 signals. 37 signals. So GitHub here. Oh, they already take that. Okay, start here. Getting real, remote. It doesn't have to be crazy at work. Shape us. An obligation to independence. Work is in war. Corporate language is filled with metaphor of war. Companies conquer the market, they capture share, they target customers, they employ a sales force, they hard headhunts, they destroy the competition, they pick their battles and make killing. That's an awful paradigm, and we want nothing to do with it. The tech industry is especially good at losing money. Oh my god, growth is electric. It's electric, but profits are elusive. We take an old school economics 101 approach, makes more than you spend. Period, bro. That's why we haven't been profitable every year we have been in business. It is a responsible way to be reliable and takes care of customers over the long haul. And I prefer to play is this long term. Oh my god, who the fuck are you guys? We don't have any jobs happening right now, no problem. We work in a small independent teams, typically on 6-week cycle. Everyone on 37 signals participating, everyone on support every few months. And twice a year, the entire company gathered in person. Read our employment handbook for more of this. Spoiler, they're great. I'm gonna take a look at this fellas here, but again, it's Hotwire. Okay.
Welcome to Hotwire, an umbrella interface, but only use the model generator for message. Now this template we have edited the screen a button and reveal the screen email added to the tray over WebSocket.
Okay. Yeah, the tech industry is no. It's because there is innovation. Innovation is costly. That's what happened. Innovation is costly, bro. Innovation is costly. That was very, very interesting, by the way. Oh my god. Totally. So there are a lot of research here, like this Hotwire. Okay. Hotwire. Very interesting thing that they're doing. Signals, which is the company here. You got is this Signal. I want to take a look at Signal here. It's like quite interesting approach. Okay. And then we're gonna take a look at setup next, static routing and that kind of thing. But the idea, or to recap here, is to understand a little bit of context as a way to see why we're using Next. What is the problem that they are solving? How do we get here to start using Next, and what is the benefit of using Next? So it all starts by looking now at the React server component. So they talk about here, React server component. Yes, a React server component, right? A problem, okay, as well as this. Exactly. So we talk about is the problem, and here is that, well, the problem is that we have different apps rendering mode. We have single page applications, server-side rendering. Single page applications initially was a good idea, because now you only send is the HTML, okay? You show a loading screen while you're in the background loading everything that you need to, right? This can impact heavily, negatively on metrics like first content full pain. In other words, it's actually, so you have to let your users to wait for your application to load. That's not a good user experience. and especially if your application relies on SEO, that's actually hurting because crawlers expect that your content be ready as soon as possible. They don't want to wait for your JavaScript is getting download. They don't want to wait for your JavaScript. They don't wait for all of your JavaScript assets to be downloaded. So, what happened next is that, well, if you, for example, look at preview of your applications, since the crawler can index your websites, like you cannot see things like that. So here we'll now take this particular approach, the server-side rendering. Okay, well, this is pretty much like a normal server-side rendering, but with a different in the initial step, which is we're going to load is the content for the initial load, for the initial page. So with the server-side rendering, okay, which to me that was quite interesting, okay. And before with the server-side rendering, so people say, well, okay, let me now have a server that's going to serve if the content dynamically on the fly if the request comes from a crawler, okay. But again, that actually was pretty nuts, and you didn't address the problem. So then we come with server-side rendering, which says, okay, so let's now make the initial loads pre-render. So let's pre-render the initial load, okay? And by doing that is, well, let's go to now pre-render the component, generate the HTML and send it to the client, so now the users can see something, and in the background we're going to load everything or all the JavaScript needed. So the client side component takes control over that, and now it guarantees you interactivity. This is something that happens so fast that you don't see that. So, okay, so now users and crawlers are happy, so the users can see the content there as well as the crawler. But when it comes to interact with the pages, what in the French though is happening here? Because now we are waiting for all this JavaScript code to get downloaded. So depend of your application, okay, it might take quite time depending on the internet connection and how big the JavaScript file was. So people become fancy here and say, hey, let's go now to do the code splitting here. We're gonna now let the framework react to chunks or applications into small bundles, and then going to send that there. But again, we didn't solve the problem. And now, with the React version 18, they introduced this thing called React Server Components. And the value proposition of this is that, unlike server-side rendering, that you're going to now download everything at once. You get the HTML and then the JavaScript bundles. Versus React Components server say, hey, let's go to render all of the HTML. Okay, let's go to download the whole HTML thing, and then when these things need interactions, download them progressively. For example, when this form needs interaction, download progressively, and you can stream that for a form or for usually a form for that. So that's the value proposition of this React server component, and that makes ton of sense. So because another use case of this is this doesn't has any JavaScript is that data fetching. I went out to this component on the server, fetch some data while rendering is the component and serve that without any JavaScript associated with. So it means that it's actually generates the content that the browser is going to render. And if we need some JavaScript, we can now load the client-side code, and we can do that by saying, hey, we want to download this at this specific time. So you have now you can choose that. So instead of downloading everything one time, again, this is an experimental things that React is doing. That Next now embrace that. Okay. And the benefit of using that is that since you now have this React service component that they don't have any JavaScript, so you make your JavaScript bundle predictable because it doesn't change in its size frequently, and also catchable, which improve the performance. Okay, this in theory sounds great. Now let's see how can we put that on action, and that is something that we're gonna do that in the next video. So take care, bye bye.